Let's look at some additional API constraints. Just like UDP, the REST API should be stateless. What does that mean? It means the server will not store anything about the latest HTTP request from the client and will treat each request as new. No prior session and no prior history required. Very similar to the normal HTTP transactions that we're familiar with. This makes sense, as we want each of the requests to contain all the information necessary for the server to understand what we want and respond accordingly. In practice, this might be slightly altered if we want the client not having to be authenticated every single time and only be authenticated in the beginning. What we will still follow is the fact that each of the requests after the initial authentication should contain all the necessary information to identify the credential of the client. We will see more example on this front in the API authentication part of this course. The next restriction deals with cacheability. It helps with scalability and performance of the RESTful API. It is stating that when applicable, if the API resource could be cached, it must declare themselves to be cacheable. This was very important in the early days of the web when bandwidth, latency, and hardware in general were not as strong as today. It is still an important constraint to follow if you think about slow satellite links or areas where people are using 2G mobile connections to access the backend API. The next restriction also has to do with scalability. REST allows you to use a layer system architecture, so we could have front-end API on server A, data storage APIs on server B, and authenticate server requests in server C. A layered and distributed system allows us to scale out when we need to without having to scale up. In normal API operations, especially over the internet between different entities, most of the time we will send static information in the format of XML and JSON. This latest constraint of code on demand is optional. It simply states that you can send executable code if needed. In practice, it is a bit dangerous to send and accept executable code via API, so we should be very careful about it. As stated before, these are just guidelines that are recommended, more or less like suggestions. So when you start to interact with other API providers in production, or when you need to build your own APIs, you might see a violation or two. Don't worry, there won't be any API police coming for you. However, we should aim to stay within these recommended constraints as much as possible.